Hansel and Gretel. Hansel and Gretel lived with their father and stepmother in a little house at the edge of the forest. The father was a poor woodcutter, and the stepmother was a selfish, nagging woman. Times were hard, and sometimes there was not enough food for them to eat. One night, as Hansel and Gretel lay awake in their beds, they heard their stepmother say, "Food is getting scarce. Soon we'll have nothing to eat." "I'll have to cut more wood to sell," said their father. "I have a better idea," said his wife. "Let's take the children deep into the forest and lose them. Then there will be fewer mouths to feed." "How can I do that to my own children?" cried the woodcutter. "Wild animals will eat them. If you don't, we'll all starve to death," scolded his wife, and she kept nagging at him until at last the poor man gave in. "Oh, Hansel," wept Gretel, "what will become of us?" "Don't worry, Gretel," said Hansel, who was used to taking care of himself and his sister. "I'll think of something." And he did. When the woodcutter and his wife were asleep, Hansel put on his coat and crept out of the house. The ground around the house was covered with little white pebbles that shone brightly in the moonlight. Hansel filled his pockets with them, crept back into the house, and went to bed. Early the next morning, the children heard their stepmother call, "Get up at once, you lazy children. We're going into the forest to cut wood." She gave each child a piece of bread to take along for lunch. As the children followed their father and stepmother into the forest, Hansel dropped the pebbles behind him. When they were deep in the forest, the woodcutter built a fire to keep the children warm. "Stay here, children, while we cut and gather wood," said their stepmother. "When we're finished, we'll take you home." All day Hansel and Gretel waited by the fire. At noon, when the sun was high in the sky, they ate their bread. But later, when it got dark and no one came back for them, Gretel began to cry. "We'll be all right when the moon comes up," Hansel told her. "For when the moon is high above the trees, we'll be able to see the white pebbles shining in the dark. They will lead us home." Sure enough, when the moon came up, the children were able to follow the trail of pebbles home. The woodcutter was happy to see his children safe, but his wife scolded them for falling asleep in the woods and not coming home. The woodcutter sold his wood, and the family had enough to eat for a while. Then times became worse than ever, and again there was little food in the house. Again the children heard their stepmother talking to their father. "We must take them deeper into the forest this time," she said. "So deep, they will never find their way out." Again the woodcutter tried to protest, but it was no use, and again Hansel waited for his parents to fall asleep. But this time when he tried to leave the house to gather the shiny pebbles, he found the door locked. Gretel wept. She was sure that there was no hope for them. But Hansel said, "Go to sleep, sister, and don't worry. I'll think of something tomorrow." Early the next morning, their stepmother got them out of bed and gave them each a piece of bread for lunch. As they followed their father through the forest, Hansel broke his bread into crumbs and dropped them to leave a trail. When they were deeper than ever in the forest, the woodcutter built a fire to keep the children warm while he and his wife went off to cut and gather wood. At noon, when the sun was high in the sky, Gretel shared her bread with Hansel, for he had used up his leaving the trail. The fire was so warm and the forest was so quiet that the children fell asleep and did not wake up until it was dark. They waited for the moon to rise and give them light. Then they set off looking for the trail of crumbs. But it was gone. The birds had eaten up all the crumbs. The two children walked all that night and all the next day too, trying to find the way home. They picked berries and ate them, but they got hungrier by the minute. They walked all the next day too, deeper and deeper into the forest, getting hungrier and more tired all the time, but they could not find the way home. On the third day, they came upon a little house standing in a clearing. The walls and roof were made of cake. The door was made of chocolate. The windows were made from spun sugar. The chimney was a peppermint stick, and the smoke coming out of it was cotton candy. Hansel and Gretel were so hungry, they broke off pieces of the cake roof and began to eat. Suddenly, they heard a little voice inside the house call, "Beast or fowl, claw or hoof, who's that nibbling on my roof?" The children replied, Whoever you are, do not fear. It's only the wind that you hear." Then Hansel and Gretel thought that the windows looked so good, they broke one of the spun sugar panes and started to eat it. And they heard the little voice say, "Hail or rain, who is eating my window pane?" And the children replied, "Whoever you are, it will pass. It's only the sun melting the glass." All at once the door opened and out came an old woman, leaning on a cane. "Now, now, children," she said in a high cackling voice, "I can't have you eating up my house." Gretel was frightened, but Hansel said, "But we are lost and very hungry." "Then come inside and have something to eat, my dears," said the old woman, purring like a cat. "And when you've eaten all you can, you will take a nap, and then I will show you how to get out of the forest." She led them inside and up to a table set with stacks of golden brown pancakes, jugs of lovely honey brown syrup, mounds of rich yellow butter, and glasses of white creamy milk. When the children had eaten, the old woman led them to 2 little beds covered with clean white sheets and soft, warm blankets. Hansel and Gretel were so tired from walking and so filled with pancakes, they lay down and went right to sleep. While they slept, the old woman went to work. Although she seemed to be so kind and thoughtful, the old woman was really a wicked witch who used her cake and candy house to trap children. Once she had them inside, she would fatten them up on all sorts of delicious foods. Then, when they were fat enough to kill them and eat them. When Hansel awoke, he found himself locked inside a wooden cage in the witch's kitchen. When Gretel awoke, the witch made her fetch wood for the fire. "We must fatten your brother," she cackled, "so he'll be tender and juicy enough for me to eat." Gretel cried bitterly, but the old witch forced her to work and cook food. The poor child was given only crab shells to eat, while Hansel was given all the best food. Each morning the witch would visit Hansel's cage and say, "Stick out your arm, dearie, so I can feel how fat you are." Hansel would stick a chicken bone through the bars. He was able to fool the witch because she had very bad eyesight. The witch would feel the bone and say, "Too skinny," and go away disappointed. Finally, after 4 weeks, the witch lost her patience. Though she could not understand why Hansel was not getting fat, she could not wait any longer. "Fill the big pot with water and put it on the fire," she told Gretel. "Today I'm going to cook and eat your brother, whether he's fat or thin." Gretel began to weep, and as she fed Hansel, the tears rolled down her cheeks. "Don't worry, Gretel," Hansel whispered. "Keep your eyes open and watch for your chance." "Get wood for the oven fire," screamed the witch. "I'll bake a pie crust, and when your brother is nicely boiled, I'll cut him up and make him into a meat pie." When the fire was roaring under the oven, the witch pushed Gretel towards it. "Crawl inside, dearie," she said, "and see if it's high enough." Gretel was sure that the witch planned to bake her too. Suddenly, she had an idea. "I can't crawl in," she said. "I'm too big to fit inside." "You stupid goose," cackled the witch. "Even I can fit in that oven. I'll show you." And she put her head through the oven door. Then Gretel, who had come up behind her, gave the witch a great shove. The witch tumbled all the way into the oven, and Gretel slammed the door shut. Oh, how the witch howled and screamed, but it did her no good. Gretel was too busy to pay her any attention. She ran to Hansel's cage, undid the lock, and pulled the door open. "Come out, Hansel," she cried. "The witch is dead, and we are free." The children searched the witch's house and found chests filled with gold coins and precious jewels. They stuffed their treasures into their pockets and once more set off to find their way home. They hadn't gone far when a white bird appeared before them, flying from branch to branch. So beautiful was this bird, and so beautifully did he sing, that the children followed him through the woods. He led them into a part of the forest that looked familiar, and they were soon able to find their way home. When they reached their father's house, they looked through the window. Their father was sitting all alone, looking sad and miserable. Hansel and Gretel rushed inside and hugged and kissed him. He was very surprised and very happy to see them. He put his arms around them and held them very close to him. "Your stepmother is dead," he told them, "but I will work harder than ever to feed you and take care of you." "You won't have to work hard any more," cried Gretel. and we'll never want for food," said Hansel. And the children emptied their pockets of the gold and jewels. From that day on, the woodcutter and his children lived happily at the edge of the forest and were never hungry again.